I will never forget that night. Even now, when I close my eyes, its sound rings in my ears. Those muffled screams, those hands that had emerged from the dirt, that moment when I felt death at the closest possible distance. I am Carla, a woman who lives in a small town in Brazil. That night, I was walking home from work as usual. My path passed by an old cemetery, but I never paid much attention. However, that night was different. A cold wind was blowing, and the full moon had cast eerie shadows on the ground. I quickened my steps to pass the place faster, but suddenly a voice stopped me. A faint voice, almost like a moan. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I took a few steps, the voice became clearer. It was as if someone was saying something from underground. I pricked up my ears and my heart pounded in my chest. I could hear cries for help, but from where? I turned on my cell phone flashlight and walked towards the graves. The soil in one of the graves looked a little messy. It looked like they had just poured dirt on it. I shone the flashlight on the surface of the grave in terror, and I will never forget that moment. A human hand, half buried in the dirt, struggled to come out. I gasped. My tongue was locked and my legs were unable to move. But the weak, trembling cries from under the dirt brought me back to myself. Help! God help me! With trembling hands, I started digging in the dirt. My fingers sank into the cold, damp dirt and my nails broke, but it didn't matter. I was terrified, but I couldn't remain indifferent. After a few moments, a man's face emerged from the dirt. His eyes were wide, his mouth was open in horror, and his breathing was labored. Help me! I'm alive! I'm alive! I immediately called the police and the emergency services on my cell phone. My hands were shaking with fear and excitement. When the officers arrived, they were also looking at the scene in disbelief. Several other people came to help, pushing the dirt aside and pulling the man out. When he was finally rescued, he was crying in terror and his arms and legs were numb. His body was cold and his heartbeat was irregular. The officers rushed him to the hospital, but what we learned later made the story even more terrifying. The man regained consciousness and was able to speak. What he said shocked even the police officers. He had been at a bar with his friends the night before. After drinking alcohol, he felt dizzy and weak. He remembered nothing after that, until he woke up in total darkness. Inside a coffin, under the ground. He had been buried alive. How? Why? The police investigation revealed that his friends had thought he had died of an alcohol overdose. Without a thorough examination, they had buried him in a hasty ceremony. But they had made a huge mistake. He was still alive. He had struggled to breathe for hours in that confined space. His oxygen had run out, his body was numb, and he felt death was getting closer and closer. But in the last moments, when he had almost given up, he had managed to knock on the coffin door with his weak fists and make a faint sound. I happened to be passing by, and if I had been a few minutes later, he might not have been alive anymore. When I met him a few days later, he was still in shock. He said he could never stay locked in a room again. He was afraid of the dark, and he had nightmares about being buried alive every night. But the thing that still haunts me is this. What if I had taken a different route that night? If no one had heard him, would anyone have known he was buried alive? Maybe. There are thousands of similar stories that will never be revealed. Maybe there were other people whose voices were never heard. And that thought is scarier than any nightmare. I heard this story when I was working as a reporter in Paris. The news was brief and strange. An old man was locked in his house, and his body was discovered months later. But when I did more research, a much more frightening truth emerged than I had imagined. The story took place in a quiet suburb in the south of France. An old man named Jacques Dubois, 79, was a quiet and reclusive man who had lived in his old house for years. He didn't socialize with anyone, but according to a few neighbors who knew him, he was a kind and gentle man. His house was small but old and sturdy, a house that seemed to be part of the city's forgotten past. No one had seen him for months. The neighbors thought he might have fallen ill and been taken to a nursing home or hospital. But when they smelled a foul odor coming from inside the house, one of them called the police. When the police arrived, they initially found no way into the house. There was no sign of a front door. It was as if there was no door at all. The officers were confused until they discovered, upon closer inspection, that the main entrance was completely blocked by a brick wall. Someone had deliberately sealed Jacques' house. As the officers began to break down the wall with sledgehammers and heavy tools, the stench of death became more intense. What lay behind that wall was something no one's mind was prepared for. Jacques' body lay on a worn-out chair in the living room. His skin was stretched over his bones, and his sunken eyes were still dry in their sockets. Beside him was a glass with a little water left in the bottom. His fingers were strangely bent, as if he had fought for his life until the very last moment. After examining the body, the medical examiner declared that Jacques had died of starvation and dehydration. He had been alive for weeks, with no way out. But what made the story even more terrifying were the scratches found on the doors and walls. It was as if Jacques had tried to escape from that hell with his fingernails in his last days. The police investigation soon identified a suspect, Jacques' neighbor, a man named Lucas Martin, 45. After reviewing security cameras and the testimony of some neighbors, it became clear that he had a long-standing conflict with Jacques. Apparently, Jacques had testified years ago that Lucas had been involved in a fraud case that had led to his imprisonment for a while. After his release, Lucas swore revenge. In the middle of the night, when no one was watching, he quietly blocked the entrance to Jacques' house with bricks and cement. From that moment on, Jacques had no way out. There was no phone in the house, the windows were small and barred, and no one was close enough to hear him. He struggled with death for weeks in solitude and terror until he finally gave up. Lucas Martin was arrested and convicted of murder. But the truth was that what he had done was even more horrific than murder. He had buried someone alive, but not in the dirt, but in a house that had slowly become an old man's coffin. The nightmare of this incident haunted me for a long time. The idea that someone could die silently and invisibly within the walls of their own home was more terrifying than any horror story I had ever heard. I never thought that anyone's life would be affected by nightmares, but this story is a truth that no one can deny. It is a story that took place on the darkest, most terrifying nights and led to someone's death. A story that blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness in a scary way. The year was 1980. A man named David went to a psychiatrist's office. At first glance, he looked like any other patient. A middle-aged man with a troubled face and hands that constantly shook. But there was something in his eyes, something that clearly showed that he was dealing with something beyond everyday anxieties. David began his story. "Dear doctor, I haven't been able to sleep for several weeks. Or rather, I have dreams from which I want to wake up, but I can't. I am in danger of death in my dreams. There is always a person approaching me in the shadows. Every night, he comes with a raised knife and threatens me. I can't wake up. I feel like I'm in the real world and there is no way I can escape these nightmares." The doctor began to ask for more details. David explained that these nightmares recur every night and that he feels extremely weak and lethargic during the day. He couldn't sleep, fear was on his face, and he couldn't find any way to escape these nightmares. But the strangest thing was that David increasingly seemed to be in danger in the real world as well. He would jump from one nightmare to another, always feeling as if an outside force was approaching him. He could not sleep every night because of fear, and this made his mental state extremely vulnerable. After several sessions of therapy, the doctor could not find a clear reason for these nightmares. David was physically healthy and showed no signs of other mental disorders. However, his nightmares became more terrifying every night. One night, David decided to stay awake, fearing that he would be killed in his sleep again. He tried to occupy himself, but every moment he felt more and more disoriented by his situation. The night was half over, and David, who had been trying to escape from sleep without stopping, could not stand it any longer. Every night this man comes, this ghostly ghost, she told the doctor. He never kills me, but he always scares me. Every night he comes closer and nothing can stop him. The next night, the nightmares became reality. While David slept in his room at home, the doctors and researchers who were investigating him discovered that David had died in his sleep. He had passed into the other world with his eyes wide open and his mouth dry, convulsing and terrified. The doctors could not find any medical reason for his death. Everything seemed like a mystery. His heart had stopped suddenly, but there was no sign of physical damage. All that remained were the nightmares that led to his death in his sleep. After David's death, further investigation was conducted, and it turned out that he was not the only person who had experienced such nightmares. In the years and decades that followed, other people who had experienced these nightmares mysteriously died. Researchers have studied the phenomenon closely and found evidence of a sinister force at the heart of these nightmares. Some people believe that these nightmares were related to some kind of magical curse. Others suspected that a ghost with evil intentions was present in the dreams. The story, which later inspired the famous film A Nightmare on Elm Street, still haunts minds. Were David's nightmares simply a figment of his imagination? Or was there an evil force behind these mysterious deaths? What caused these nightmares to take people's lives? Could dreams and reality one day merge and lead us to a more terrifying world? We still don't know, but one thing is clear. David's nightmares were more than just a dream. They were a sinister reality that gradually took shape in the darkness of the night, destroying lives. The house we lived in was an old house in a quiet suburb of Ohio. A house where the walls whispered, the floorboards creaked, and the nights were too quiet. I was a 16-year-old girl named Kelly, who always felt that something was not right in this house. It might seem strange to others, but every night, just as I turned out the light in my room and went to bed, I would feel someone's heavy gaze on my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, or maybe a hallucination from the horror stories I had read. But the feeling kept coming back every night. Sometimes it would get so strong that my heart would beat faster and my breathing would become labored. I opened the door several times, but there was nothing but darkness in the hallway. When I told my parents about it, they just laughed. My mother said, "Kelly, you watch too many horror movies." My father joked, "Maybe we should turn on a night light for you, little one." But I knew something was wrong. Someone was standing outside my door. Every night, one night, right around 3 in the morning, I felt someone standing right in front of my door. This time it was stronger than ever. I felt like something was watching me. I didn't dare get out of bed. I just stared at the door. A moment later, a pale shadow passed under the door. Someone was outside. I gasped, putting my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. A few moments later, the doorknob began to move slowly. Slowly, very slowly. It was as if someone was trying to check if it was locked. My whole body froze. As I stared at the door in terror, I heard a soft rustling sound. It was like something dragging on the doorknob. It was like someone's fingernails. At that moment, I turned on my bedroom light and ran to the door. I opened it, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, but I swear, just a moment ago, someone was there. The next day, when my father came home from work, I finally convinced him to check. He reluctantly searched the entire house with my mother and me. He checked every hatch, every closet, even the basement. We found nothing, but as he climbed the basement stairs, his expression changed. He said quietly, "There's something strange here." He went over to the wall and traced a piece of old wood with his finger. When he shone the flashlight on it, we found something terrifying. A small hole in the wall exactly the size of a human eye. What does this mean? My father immediately grabbed tools and started pulling out the wooden boards of the wall. And that's when the real horror showed itself. An empty space, big enough for someone to hide in. Inside were signs of someone's presence, an old blanket, a few empty food packages, and most terrifying of all, a few photos of us. Photos taken without our knowledge. Photos of me in the bedroom. My mother is in the kitchen. My father is on the couch. And then, as we stared at each other in shock at this maddening discovery, I heard a soft sound from my room. Footsteps. My father quickly ran to my room and opened the door. And in the darkness, right there behind the door, stood a man. Tall, thin, in old clothes, with eyes that shone in the dim light. For a few moments, he just stared at us as if he didn't know he was trapped. Then suddenly, with inhuman speed, he ran past us and down the stairs. My father shouted, "Don't run away." But the man was too fast to catch him. He ran out the back door of the house and disappeared into the darkness of the night. When the police arrived, they did everything they could. But the man was never caught. We later learned that he had been living inside our walls for months, maybe years. He would watch us at night through a hole in the wall. The police said it wasn't the first time something like this had happened in the area. We moved out of that house. But still, every night, when I turn off the lights and get ready for bed, I feel that familiar feeling. That heavy feeling, that stare. Have we escaped him? Sarah and David, a young newlywed couple, decided to travel to a remote and peaceful area for their honeymoon. David found a small but stylish hotel on the internet, located in the heart of a dense forest. It was called the Aspen House Hotel. The hotel had an old but beautiful appearance. The wooden walls with carved patterns, the large fireplace in the lobby, and the staircase covered with red carpet created a classic and relaxing atmosphere. When they arrived at the hotel, the manager greeted them with a strange and cold smile and gave them the key to room number 303. Their room was on the third floor. The wooden door creaked open, and the interior, with classic furniture and a large old-style bed, created a nostalgic feeling. But something was strange in the air. The air seemed heavy, and Sarah felt that someone was standing in the corner of the room. David, who was always reasonable, said, "He's just tired. Let's get some rest." When night fell, they lay down on the bed. Everything was quiet until the middle of the night when a soft sound was heard from the door. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingernails on the door. Sarah jumped up and woke David up. "Did you hear?" Maybe it was the wind or one of the other guests. David got up and opened the door, but no one was there. Tired, he quickly returned to bed, but Sarah could not sleep anymore. The next morning, Sarah decided to ignore the matter. But when she went to the bathroom, she noticed that the steam on the mirror had taken the shape of a hand. The hand was huge, as if it did not belong to a normal person. When David entered the bathroom, he said, "Sarah, you are very imaginative. Maybe the steam is due to the temperature difference." They went to spend the day in the nearby forest. Nature was beautiful and everything seemed peaceful. But all this time Sarah felt that someone was watching them. That night, the same soft sound was heard again. But this time, the sound was clearer, footsteps moving on the carpet. David got up tiredly and searched the entire room. No one was there. But when he returned to the bed, he saw that one of the pillows was strangely wet, as if someone had dipped it in water. David said, "This is not normal anymore. Maybe someone is playing a joke." Sarah and David went to the hotel manager and told him what had happened. The manager, whose smile was colder than usual, said, "It's always quiet here. Maybe your hallucinations are due to fatigue. You can change rooms if you want." But David, suspicious of the manager's behavior, asked him about the hotel's history. The manager said evasively, "It's an old hotel, but nothing to worry about." David and Sarah went to the local library to research the hotel. There, they learned that a horrific murder had occurred in room 303 50 years ago. A woman named Margaret had been strangled in that room by her husband and her body was never found. That night, when Sarah and David returned to their room, the air felt heavier than usual. They both decided to stay up until morning. But around 3 a.m., the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The candle they had lit went out for no reason. Sarah whispered, "Someone is here." Suddenly, a whisper came from the corner of the room. "You took my place." A tall shadow appeared in the darkness. A woman with long, black hair and lifeless eyes stared at them. David shouted, "Sarah, run!" But at that moment, the door was locked and they could not leave the room. The shadowy creature came closer. Sarah looked at David in horror and said, "What does it want?" David, breathing hard, realized that this ghost was seeking revenge. They tried to break down the door, but a strange force prevented them from leaving. The last thing they saw was a shadow moving on the wall, and then a scream broke the silence of the hotel. The next morning, room 303 was empty. No one knew what had happened to Sarah and David. All that remained were the wet pillows and a steamy mirror with the words, "You're next." The hotel manager welcomed new guests, and room 303 was still available for those who wanted to experience a night of excitement and fear.